I walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse feeling the heavy Georgia heat on my skin, but for the first time in 5 years, I could finally breathe. The ink on my divorce decree was barely dry. Exactly 30 minutes later, I picked up my phone and called my father. Fire. All 23 employees Loretta planted in the company. Right now. Cut their server access before they even know what hit them. I knew the retaliation would be swift, but I was ready. That very evening, my ex-mother-in-law kicked in my front door screaming and demanding I hand over the deed to my house. But she had no idea that I was already 5 steps ahead, holding the exact financial records that would send her entire family to federal prison. Before I tell you how I dismantled a megachurch dynasty in a single afternoon, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down your own life just to rid yourself of a toxic family. The heavy oak door of my Buckhead estate slammed open with such force that the security chime blared through the foyer. I was pouring myself a glass of Cabernet when Loretta Carter marched into my dining room, bypassing the gate security using the access code Terrence had secretly given her. She marched past my custom velvet sofa, her signature oversized church hat sitting perfectly on her head, looking every bit the pious First Lady of Atlanta's largest megachurch. But the absolute fury burning in her eyes was anything but holy. She stopped right in front of me, her chest heaving as she glared at me with pure venom. "Sign this right now, Valerie!" She hurled a thick, legally binding document onto my quartz dining table, knocking over a crystal coaster. I did not flinch. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the heavy silence stretch between us. When I finally looked down, the document was a quitclaim deed for my house paired with a ridiculous demand for $10,000 a month in spousal maintenance for her son. "You must be completely out of your mind, Loretta," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Terrence and I are divorced as of 3 o'clock today. The judge already threw out his ridiculous alimony request. You have no legal standing to be in my home." "You owe him!" she shrieked, slamming her manicured hands onto the table. "You wasted 5 years of my son's youth. He gave you the best years of his life, waiting for you to give this family a grandson. And what did you do? You prioritized spreadsheets and late nights at the office. A woman's true wealth is her family, Valerie, not her bank account. You are going to sign over 30% of your father's company shares to Terrence to compensate for your failure as a wife." I picked up the document, amused by the sheer audacity of it. Terrence had finessed his way into the Vice President of Human Resources role at my father's company, Washington Freight and Logistics, purely because my father, Jerome, had always desperately wanted a son to inherit his trucking empire. Terrence played the part perfectly, wearing the right tailored suits, saying the right prayers at Sunday service, and pretending to be the perfect husband while secretly treating my father's payroll like his personal piggy bank. "You think that fancy forensic accounting degree from Spelman makes you a real woman?" Loretta mocked, pacing around my dining room like she owned the place. "You are nothing but a cold calculator. My son deserves the company shares he was promised. He built that human resources department from the ground up while you were busy crunching numbers like a soulless machine." I walked over to my desk and dropped her legal document straight into the paper shredder. "He did not build a human resources department, Loretta. He built a fraudulent payroll pipeline." I watched her face twitch as the machine chewed up her ridiculous demands. For the last 6 months of our separation, while Terrence thought I was crying over our failed marriage, I was conducting a ghost audit. Every night at 2 in the morning, I pulled the encrypted logs and traced every single dime. Loretta scoffed, crossing her arms defensively, though her eyes darted toward the door. "You are speaking nonsense. Terrence is an executive. He is respected in our church and in this city. You are just bitter because he realized you were never going to be a proper wife." "He is a thief," I corrected sharply, stepping closer to her. "He put 23 people on my father's payroll. 23 of your church choir members, your cousins, and your so-called spiritual advisors." I tracked the key fob logs. None of those people have stepped foot in the Washington Freight Building in 2 years, yet they draw $75,000 salaries with full benefits. Loretta's confident posture faltered just a fraction. You have no proof of anything. Connor set up those systems. He is the IT director. A smart white man with a degree from Georgia Tech is not going to let a bitter ex-wife snoop through his secure servers. Connor has everything locked down tight. I smiled, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. You are right about one thing. Connor is an arrogant tech brother who thought his privilege made him smarter than me, but he left a digital footprint the size of an 18-wheeler. Before Loretta could fire back another insult, the silence of my dining room was shattered by the shrill ringing of her cell phone. She glared at me, pulling the phone from her designer handbag. The caller ID flashed Terrence's name. She answered it, putting it on speakerphone, likely expecting her son to demand I sign the papers. Instead, raw panic blasted through the speaker. "Mom, you need to get over here right now." Terrence was hyperventilating, the sound of heavy footsteps and shouting echoing in the background. My company car just got towed right out of the executive lot. My corporate credit cards are declining, and there are 2 armed security guards boxing up my office. They are physically escorting me out of the building. Loretta froze, the phone trembling in her hand. "Terrence, calm down. What is happening? Where is Connor?" "Connor is locked out too," Terrence yelled, his voice cracking with pure terror. "His server access is gone. They deactivated our badges. Dad's security chief said Valerie gave the order. Mom, we are completely locked out of the company." Loretta slowly lowered the phone, her face draining of all color as she stared at me. The pious, untouchable megachurch matriarch suddenly looked like a terrified deer caught in the headlights. I leaned against my kitchen island, swirling the dark red wine in my glass. "I guess you forgot to read the secondary clauses in my final divorce filing, Loretta." I smiled, looking her dead in the eyes. "I do not just audit companies. I clean house, and the extermination just started." The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt of the Washington Freight and Logistics Executive parking lot. I pulled my sleek black sedan into my reserved spot, feeling the adrenaline from last night's confrontation with Loretta still humming in my veins. Before I could even cut the engine, the loud squeal of tires echoed across the empty lot. A shiny silver sports car swerved aggressively and cut across 2 parking spaces to firmly block my vehicle in. Terrence stepped out of the driver's side, slamming his door so hard the windows rattled, but he was not alone. From the passenger side emerged Connor. He was married to Terrence's sister and was the so-called technology genius Terrence had convinced my father to hire. Connor marched toward my car, waving a thick stack of printed papers like a weapon. I stepped out of my car and calmly adjusted my tailored blazer, completely unbothered by the sight of 2 grown men throwing a tantrum before 9 in the morning. "You have completely lost your mind," Valerie Connor shouted. His face flushed red as he shoved the stack of papers inches from my chest. "This is a massive violation of federal labor laws and corporate compliance. You cannot just terminate 23 employees overnight without cause or proper notice. I am filing a wrongful termination and discrimination lawsuit that will bankrupt your father by Friday." Terrence stood behind him with his arms crossed, trying to look intimidating, but his shifting eyes betrayed his absolute panic. "You should have just signed the maintenance agreement, Valerie. Now Connor is going to take everything your dad built." Connor sneered, looking down his nose at me with the exact same condescending glare he always used at our family barbecues. He always loved playing the brilliant white savior for the Washington family, acting like my father somehow needed a mediocre tech brother to legitimize his wealth. My father built a nationwide logistics empire from a single delivery truck through blood and sweat, but Connor always treated him like an amateur. "Let the professionals handle the corporate restructuring," Valerie Connor mocked, tapping the legal papers against his palm. "You are just a glorified bookkeeper playing business dress-up. You do not understand the legal nightmare you just triggered with your emotional little outburst. These people have ironclad employment contracts. They have legal rights and union protections. You cannot just fire them because you are bitter about your divorce." I did not raise my voice or step back. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen twice and held it up so the bright glare of the spreadsheet reflected right into Connor's arrogant eyes. "I understand contracts perfectly, Connor," I said, my voice steady and freezing cold. "But I also understand payroll fraud and federal embezzlement." Terrence flinched and took a physical step back, but I kept my eyes locked solely on Connor. For the last 6 months of my marriage, while Terrence was busy taking extended business trips that I now know were financed by my father's company, I conducted a comprehensive forensic ghost audit. I scrolled down the screen, highlighting 23 rows of data in bright red. 23 employees, Connor. 23 people pulling $75,000 base salaries with full medical and dental benefits. Let us look at the key fob entry logs, shall we? I swiped to the next page, showing a sea of zeros across the access tracking software. According to the security system you personally manage, none of these 23 people have stepped foot inside the Washington Freight Building in exactly 2 years. Your mother-in-law's church choir director, her 2 cousins, and her so-called spiritual advisors. They are ghost employees, Terrence. They do not work here. They have never worked here. You two just created a fake payroll pipeline to siphon nearly $2 million a year out of my father's operating budget. Connor swallowed hard, the legal papers in his hand suddenly lowering to his side. "You cannot prove they did not work remotely," he stammered, though his voice severely lacked its previous bite. "Really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I cross-referenced the IP addresses from their required daily server check-ins. They were all logging in from the exact same singular IP address. The router sitting on the desk in your home office, Connor. You were logging them in yourself every single morning to fake their active employment status." The silence in the parking lot was absolute and deafening. Terrence looked like he might actually be sick, leaning against the silver sports car for physical support. I smiled, locking my tablet and dropping it back into my tote bag. "So go ahead and file that wrongful termination lawsuit, Connor. I highly encourage it. I am sure the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Labor would absolutely love to see my forensic findings during the legal discovery phase." I turned my back to them and began walking toward the main glass entrance of the corporate building, ready to leave them both scrambling in the dust of their own ruined scheme. But Connor did not panic and run like Terrence. Instead, a slow, dark smirk spread across his face as he dropped his righteous white knight facade entirely. He straightened his collar and let out a dry, hollow laugh that echoed across the parking lot. "Cute audit, Valerie," he called out, forcing me to stop in my tracks. "You are right about the login locations. I logged them in, but I also control the master servers." I turned back slowly, narrowing my eyes. Connor pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a single button on his screen. "I am the IT director, remember?" he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I just encrypted the master server and locked the entire logistics routing system. Every single delivery schedule, GPS tracker, and freight manifest is gone into the dark. Your dad's fleet of 150 trucks are completely paralyzed nationwide as we speak." Connor slowly slipped the phone back into his expensive suit pocket, his eyes gleaming with pure malicious satisfaction. "Give Terrence his 30% share of the company by noon today, or Washington Freight defaults on every major client contract, and your father's legacy dies today." I walked past Connor and Terrence, leaving them standing in the sweltering parking lot, and pushed through the heavy glass doors of Washington Freight and Logistics. The moment I stepped onto the executive floor, the sheer volume of chaos hit me like a physical wave. The usually quiet dispatch center was a war zone. Dozens of phones were ringing simultaneously with flashing red lights, lighting up every terminal. Dispatchers were shouting into headsets, frantically trying to explain to angry clients why their shipments were suddenly sitting idle on the sides of highways across the country. I found my father Jerome pacing behind the massive oak desk in his corner office. His tie was loosened, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. 150 trucks, Valerie," he said, his voice shaking as he stared at the massive digital tracking map on his wall, which had frozen completely gray. "We have contracts with pharmaceutical companies and grocery chains." If those refrigerated trailers do not get routing clearance in the next 2 hours, we lose millions in inventory. We lose the contracts. We lose everything I built. Before I could comfort him, the office door swung open. Terrence strolled in with Connor right behind him. Terrence had perfectly adjusted his posture, replacing his earlier parking lot panic with the smooth, polished demeanor of a reasonable businessman. He buttoned his suit jacket and sighed, looking at my father with absolute fake sympathy. "Jerome, this is a disaster," Terrence said, shaking his head. "I told Connor to run a diagnostic, but it looks like the entire logistics network suffered a catastrophic encryption failure. The system is totally locked down. But listen to me carefully. I care about this family. I care about you. Connor thinks he can reverse the encryption and salvage the routing data before we default on the delivery contracts." My father looked up, desperation shining in his eyes. "Tell him to do it, right now." Terrence held up a hand, playing the ultimate peacemaker. "He will. But we need to settle this family business first." Valerie was incredibly emotional yesterday and made some rash decisions about my employment. If she just signs a simple, legally binding agreement right now, transferring 30% of the Washington Freight shares to my name as a divorce settlement adjustment, Connor will unlock the servers. Think of it as a small price to pay to save the company, Jerome. I stood silently watching the absolute audacity of the man I had once married. He was attempting to extort my father for millions of dollars while pretending to be his savior. Connor stood by the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin. He truly believed he held all the cards. He thought his little tech stunt had checkmated a 31-year-old woman who he believed only knew how to run basic spreadsheets. "Sign it, Valerie," my father pleaded, his voice cracking. "Just sign the shares over. We can fight the divorce terms in court later, but we cannot lose the fleet today." I did not reach for the pen Terrence was holding out to me. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked straight out of my father's office, heading down the hallway toward the glass-walled server room. Terrence and Connor followed me, barking demands. "Where are you going?" Valerie, Connor mocked. "You cannot reboot the system. It requires a 32-character encryption key that only exists in my head. You are wasting time, and your dad's trucks are sitting on the shoulder of the interstate." I swiped my security badge on the server room door and stepped into the freezing air-conditioned space. Connor was an arrogant tech brother who thought his degree made him untouchable. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that arrogant men were almost always lazy. During my 6-month separation, I had noticed that Connor never performed physical backups of our logistics data. He relied entirely on cloud servers because it required zero physical effort on his part. He thought he was a genius for deploying a basic ransomware script to lock us out. He had no idea that a month ago, I had quietly hired an independent elite cybersecurity firm from Chicago. I had paid them to mirror our entire server architecture every single night at 3 in the morning, downloading all operational data onto a decentralized physical drive completely disconnected from Connor's network. I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out a heavy, solid-state master override drive. It was slightly larger than a brick and worth its weight in gold. "What is that?" Connor demanded, his smug smile finally faltering as he stepped toward the glass door. I did not answer him. I walked over to the primary server rack, bypassed the encrypted network switch, and plugged the physical drive directly into the emergency restoration port. I typed in a 12-digit administrative sequence that I had established specifically for this moment. The primary monitor went completely black for 3 agonizing seconds. Terrence laughed nervously from the hallway. "You cannot fix this, Val. Just give me the shares." Suddenly, the fans in the server rack roared to life. The screen flared a bright, brilliant blue. A progress bar flashed across the monitor, hitting 100% instantly. I walked back out to the dispatch floor, leaving the drive connected. My father was standing in the doorway of his office, staring at the massive tracking map on the wall. The gray, frozen screen flickered and then burst into a sea of bright green moving dots. 150 trucks were instantly reconnected to the routing matrix. The GPS coordinates refreshed. The dispatchers erupted into cheers as their phone lines cleared and the delivery schedules populated back onto their screens. Washington Freight was fully operational. Connor stood frozen in the hallway, his jaw slack as he stared at the green dots on the screen. His ultimate weapon had been dismantled in less than 3 minutes by a woman he had called a glorified bookkeeper. "You are done here, Connor," I said, my voice carrying across the now quiet hallway. "And since you just admitted in front of my father to deploying malicious ransomware on a commercial server, you are incredibly lucky I am not having you arrested for cyberterrorism right this second. Get out of my building." Terrence looked like all the air had been violently knocked out of his lungs. He grabbed Connor's arm and dragged his brother-in-law toward the elevator, realizing their extortion play had just completely imploded. My father slumped against the doorframe of his office, pressing his hands over his face in pure relief. "You saved the company, Val," he whispered. But I was not celebrating yet. I walked back into the server room to verify the restored data logs. I needed to ensure the financial architecture was intact before I allowed the accounting department to resume wire transfers. I pulled up the primary payroll ledger, scanning the columns of data that had just been recovered from my physical backup. Everything looked perfectly normal until I applied a filter for automated recurring transactions. A specific anomaly instantly caught my eye. It was buried deep under a miscellaneous vendor code, but my trained eyes spotted the pattern immediately. Every single Friday for the past 2 years, exactly at 4 in the afternoon, an automated wire transfer of $25,000 was being quietly siphoned out of the Washington Freight payroll account. I traced the routing numbers. The money was not going to a logistics vendor or a truck maintenance facility. It was being wired directly into an external bank account registered under the exact name Church Youth Foundation. I did the math in my head. $100,000 a month, $1.2 million a year. The destination account belonged to the exact same megachurch where my former mother-in-law Loretta reigned as the untouchable First Lady. I left the server room with the decrypted logs loaded securely onto my tablet. The destination of the stolen funds was a bank account registered to the Greater Atlanta Cathedral of Praise. It was the exact same megachurch where Loretta Carter paraded around as the untouchable head of the elder board. I did not waste a single second. I walked straight out to my car and drove across town to the sprawling church campus. The parking lot was packed with luxury vehicles. Loretta was hosting her annual high society charity luncheon today. It was an exclusive event where Atlanta's wealthy elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks while pretending to care about the community. I walked through the massive double doors of the fellowship hall. The room was decorated with crystal centerpieces and towering floral arrangements. At the very front of the room stood Loretta. She was wearing a tailored white suit, holding a microphone, and basking in the adoration of 200 wealthy donors. She spotted me walking down the center aisle. For a brief second, I saw a flash of genuine panic cross her face. She knew Terrence and Connor had failed to secure the company shares. But Loretta was a master manipulator, and this was her sanctuary. Instead of retreating, she decided to use her audience as a weapon. She raised her hand, gesturing for the string quartet to stop playing. She gripped the microphone tightly and let out a heavy theatrical sigh. "Brothers and sisters," Loretta announced, her voice echoing through the massive hall. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Look who just walked through our doors. My former daughter-in-law, Valerie." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at me. I kept my posture perfectly straight and continued walking toward the front stage. Loretta closed her eyes and bowed her head, putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Let us bow our heads and pray for Valerie," she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Lord, we ask that you soften her hard and bitter heart. We pray that you deliver her from her obsession with money and corporate titles. We ask that you heal the anger she carries from her failed marriage and her inability to build a proper family. Touch her soul, Lord, so she may find peace, instead of trying to destroy the lives of those who only ever tried to love her." Several women in the front row murmured their agreement, nodding sympathetically at Loretta. It was the ultimate display of respectability politics. She was trying to humiliate me in front of the most powerful people in the city, branding me as a broken, bitter career woman. I stopped right at the edge of the stage. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply walked up the short flight of stairs, stepped right into Loretta's personal space, and gently took the microphone out of her hand. She was so shocked by my calm demeanor that she actually let go. I turned to face the crowd, offering a warm and polite smile. "Thank you for that beautiful prayer, Loretta," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear over the sound system. "And thank you everyone for gathering here today to support the youth of our city. I actually came here today on behalf of my father, Jerome Washington, and Washington Freight and Logistics." I saw the head pastor sitting at the main VIP table. He was a distinguished man who had led the congregation for 20 years. I walked down the steps and stood directly in front of his table, holding the microphone close. "Pastor Davis," I said, maintaining unbroken eye contact with him. "My father and I have been reviewing our corporate philanthropy accounts this morning. As you know, Washington Freight has always been a proud supporter of this community. I am here today because we want to see the specific community impact reports for the Church Youth Foundation." The pastor offered a polite but deeply confused smile. "Sister Valerie, we are always grateful for your family, but I am not sure I understand what reports you are looking for." I kept my voice loud enough for every single donor in the room to hear. "I am looking for the expenditure reports for the automated corporate donations we have been sending. Exactly $25,000 has been wired from the Washington Freight payroll account into the Church Youth Foundation account every single Friday for the past 24 months. That is $1.5 million over the last year alone. My father and I simply want to know which youth programs have benefited from our $1.5 million contribution." The silence that fell over the fellowship hall was absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. Nobody took a breath. The pastor stood up from his chair. His polite smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound shock. He looked at me and then looked up at Loretta, who was standing on the stage. "Sister Valerie," the pastor said, his voice trembling slightly, "I do not know what bank records you are looking at, but Washington Freight and Logistics has not made a single financial donation to this church since December of 2023. The collective gasp from the audience sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. I slowly turned my head to look back at the stage. Loretta was gripping the acrylic podium so hard her knuckles were white. All the blood had completely drained from her face. Her pious, untouchable facade was shattering into a million pieces right in front of her wealthiest peers. The untouchable church matriarch had just been publicly exposed for routing $1.5 million of corporate funds into a phantom charity account. I raised the microphone to my lips, ready to demand exactly where Loretta had hidden my father's money. But before I could speak, a heavy hand clamped down violently on my shoulder. Fingers dug deep into my collarbone, spinning me around. It was Terrence. He was completely out of breath, his expensive suit jacket wrinkled from his frantic rush across town after my security guards had thrown him out of the logistics building. His eyes were wide and frantic like a cornered animal, realizing he was entirely trapped. He leaned in so close I could feel his panicked breath against my neck. "Shut your mouth, Valerie," Terrence hissed, his voice a desperate, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You need to drop this right now. If you expose that Youth Foundation fund, you are not just taking down my mother. The offshore accounts were set up using your father's digital signature. If you bring the authorities into this, your father goes to federal prison for corporate tax evasion." I yanked my arm out of his grasp so violently that his hand slapped against his own chest. The wealthy donors at the front tables were already starting to whisper, their eyes darting between the pale pastor and my former mother-in-law, who was still standing frozen on the stage. But I was not about to let Terrence dictate the terms of this war in the middle of a crowded banquet hall. I grabbed the lapel of his wrinkled suit and forcefully steered him away from the stunned pastor. We marched down the plush-carpeted hallway of the megachurch, moving quickly away from the prying eyes of the congregation. I shoved him into the pastoral green room, a lavishly decorated suite reserved for visiting guest speakers, and kicked the heavy mahogany door shut behind us. The thick wood immediately cut off the ambient noise of the charity luncheon, leaving us in absolute silence. Terrence immediately dropped his terrified husband act. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating darkness that I had never seen during our entire 5 years of marriage. He casually adjusted his tie, smoothed out his jacket, and walked over to the leather sofa. He poured himself a glass of water from a crystal carafe, taking his time as if he had just won a major victory. "You think you are so brilliant, Valerie?" he said, taking a slow sip of water. "You think that fancy forensic audit of yours gives you all the leverage in the world. But you only looked at the destination of the stolen funds. You never bothered to look at the authorization protocols." I stood near the door, keeping my posture completely rigid. "I know exactly how corporate payroll is authorized, Terrence. It requires dual authentication from the Human Resources Director and the Chief Financial Officer." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the soundproof room. "Not when the funds are routed through the executive discretionary accounts." He smirked, walking slowly toward me. "Connor and I did not just wire money directly to my mother's church. We layered the transactions like professionals. We funneled the cash through 3 different offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands before it ever touched the Youth Foundation ledger. And every single one of those offshore transfers was authorized, approved, and digitally signed by Jerome Washington." My stomach plummeted, but I kept my face perfectly blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. "My father would never sign off on an offshore transfer," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. Terrence stepped closer, a vicious look of absolute triumph twisting his features. "He did not have to sign anything physically, Valerie. Your dad is a dinosaur. He built a massive national trucking empire, but he can barely operate his own smartphone without asking his assistant for help. He trusted me. He always wanted a son to pass his legacy down to, and you were never going to be the boy he desperately wanted. I played the dutiful son perfectly. I took him to golf tournaments every Sunday. I drank his terrible scotch. I sat in his office and listened to his boring stories about building the fleet from a single delivery truck. And in exchange for playing the golden boy, he gave me his master administrative access tokens." Terrence paced across the thick carpet, waving his hands as he detailed the mechanics of his ultimate betrayal. He handed over his physical security key fobs and his digital signature protocols because he thought I was helping him manage the corporate tax burden. He trusted me more than he ever trusted his own daughter. So on paper, Jerome Washington is a corporate criminal. He is intentionally embezzling his own company funds and hiding them in offshore accounts to avoid federal taxes. The sheer scale of the frame job was breathtaking. Connor and Terrence had spent years building a meticulous digital paper trail that pointed directly to my father. If the authorities investigated the logs, it would look exactly like a classic executive tax evasion scheme. "If you take those decrypted server logs to the authorities," Terrence hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, "the IRS Criminal Investigation Division will freeze every single asset Washington Freight possesses by tomorrow morning. They will seize the trucks, the distribution warehouses, and the corporate bank accounts. Your father will be indicted for federal tax evasion and corporate fraud. He will spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary, and his legacy will be completely wiped off the face of the earth." I stared at the man I had shared a home with for 5 years. He was a parasite who had fed off my family and now threatened to burn the host to the ground just to save himself. My mind raced through the forensic implications of his threat. Tracing the digital signatures back to Connor's IP address and proving my father had been digitally impersonated would take months of federal investigation. During that time, Washington Freight would absolutely be frozen by the government. My father could not survive the stress of a federal indictment or seeing his life work seized. Terrence thought he had me completely cornered. "So here is how this is going to work, Valerie," he commanded, jabbing a finger toward my face. "You are going to go back to your lawyer and rip up that divorce decree. You are going to sign the deed to the Buckhead estate over to me today. And you are going to draft a legal transfer of 30% of your father's corporate shares into my name as a spousal settlement. You do that and I keep the digital signature logs buried. Your father gets to retire in peace and keep his freedom." Before I could even begin to formulate a countermeasure, the heavy mahogany door of the green room did not just open, it was violently kicked open. The loud crash of the wood hitting the wall made Terrence jump backward in sheer terror. Standing in the doorway was a young, striking black woman. She was heavily pregnant, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. She wore a casual yellow sundress, but the absolute fury radiating from her eyes was powerful enough to set the room on fire. She marched past me, entirely ignoring my presence, and stormed straight up to Terrence. He turned ghost white, backing up until the back of his legs hit the leather sofa. "Maya," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "What are you doing here? You are not supposed to be at the church." She did not say a single word in response. She reached into her oversized leather handbag, pulled out a thick stack of printed papers, and hurled them directly at his chest. The papers scattered across the floor, revealing red overdue stamps and hospital logos. They were stacks of unpaid medical bills. "You told me the divorce was already done." "Terrence?" Maya yelled, her voice trembling with absolute rage. "You told me the papers were signed and the Buckhead house was legally yours. You promised me we were moving in next week to set up the nursery before the baby arrives." Terrence desperately tried to shush her, glancing nervously in my direction. "Maya, baby, please calm down. You are going to stress the baby. We can talk about this outside." "Do not tell me to calm down!" she screamed, swatting his hands away as he tried to touch her arm. "I just tried to pay the deposit for my delivery room at Piedmont Hospital, and my card declined. I checked my banking app. Why did my corporate consulting paycheck bounce this morning, Terrence? Why is my account frozen?" The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place with brilliant clarity. The ghost payroll. I had terminated 23 employees this morning and immediately cut their direct deposits. Maya was not just his mistress. She was one of the ghost employees. Terrence had been funding his secret second family using the stolen money from Washington Freight. I slowly crossed my arms, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face as I watched his entire house of cards begin to collapse. I watched the realization wash over Terrence as he stared at the pregnant woman standing in the doorway of the pastoral green room. The heavy silence was broken by the sound of Loretta gasping. My former mother-in-law recovered from her initial shock and immediately rushed forward to shield her precious son. She placed her body between Terrence and Maya, her face twisting into a mask of pious outrage. "Who do you think you are barging into this sanctuary?" Loretta demanded, her voice shaking with righteous fury. "I do not know what kind of lies you are trying to spin, but my son is a respectable man of God. You are nothing but a delusional liar trying to extort a wealthy family. Terrence has never seen you before in his life." Maya let out a harsh, bitter laugh and pointed directly at Loretta. "Do not play dumb with me, Lady Loretta. I sat at your dining room table last Thanksgiving while Valerie was out of town visiting her father. You told me I was going to be a much better wife to your son than that cold corporate robot he married. You knew exactly who I was and you knew exactly where the money was coming from." Loretta flinched, her eyes darting nervously toward me. The matriarch of the Greater Atlanta Cathedral of Praise had not just tolerated her son's affair. She had actively nurtured it. She had welcomed his pregnant mistress into her home while I was busy running audits to save my father's company. She had sat across from me at family dinners, smiling and praying over the food, knowing exactly what her son was doing behind my back. Before Loretta could utter another denial, Connor stepped forward from the corner of the room. He had slipped in behind Terrence earlier and clearly realized that Maya was about to detonate their entire offshore financial structure. Connor dropped his arrogant tech brother attitude and lunged toward the doorway, his face pale with sudden desperation. "We are leaving right now," Connor barked. He reached out and grabbed Maya by the upper arm, his fingers digging roughly into her skin. He yanked the pregnant woman backward toward the hallway, using an excessive amount of aggressive physical force. "You are trespassing on private church property, and you are going to walk out to the parking lot right this second before I have you arrested for harassment." Maya cried out in pain, stumbling backward as Connor tried to drag her out of the room. He did not care that she was carrying his brother's child. He only cared about silencing the one person who could connect the dots of their fraudulent scheme. "Let her go," I commanded, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls with absolute authority. I stepped quickly across the carpet, placing myself directly between Connor and Maya. I slapped Connor's hand away from her arm with enough force to make him stumble back in surprise. I pushed Maya gently behind me, shielding her from the two men who had used her as a pawn in their massive corporate theft. I could feel Maya shaking behind me, but I stood my ground, staring down the two cowards who thought they had won. "You do not get to touch her, Connor," I said, staring him down. "And you certainly do not get to dictate who stays and who leaves." "Valerie, stay out of this," Terrence shouted, stepping out from behind his mother. "She is crazy. She is just making things up to get cash out of us. You cannot believe a word she says." I ignored Terrence completely and turned my attention to the frightened woman standing behind me. Maya was breathing heavily, holding her stomach as she glared at the man who had promised her a brand new life. Her anger was entirely justified, but I needed her focused. I needed her to understand exactly what kind of danger she was in. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Terrence did not just lie to you about his divorce. He lied to you about your paycheck. That consulting fee you have been receiving every week was stolen directly from Washington Freight and Logistics. You are listed on our corporate servers as a ghost employee. That means when I hand my forensic audit over to the federal authorities this afternoon, your name will be on the list of individuals indicted for corporate embezzlement." Maya's eyes widened in pure terror. I did not know she stammered, taking a step back. "Terrence told me he set up a private contracting account for me. He said it was an advance on his inheritance. I swear I did not know it was stolen money. Please, you have to believe me." "I believe you," I said, maintaining eye contact with her. "But the Internal Revenue Service does not care about what you believed. They care about whose name is on the receiving bank account. They care about the paper trail. However, I am the sole auditor of record for this investigation. I am the one drafting the final report for the federal prosecutors. I can offer you a deal right here and right now." Terrence lunged forward, his face contorted in panic. "Do not listen to her, Maya. She is bluffing. She does not have any power over the feds." I did not break eye contact with Maya. "I will grant you total legal immunity," I promised, my voice unwavering. "I will personally remove your name and your banking details from the ghost payroll ledger before I submit the encrypted files to the authorities. You will not face a single charge of embezzlement or tax fraud. You will walk away from this completely clean. But in exchange, you are going to give me everything you have on Terrence: passwords, login credentials, and any personal devices he left at your apartment. I need the digital keys to his kingdom." Maya did not even hesitate. The betrayal she felt from Terrence had completely severed whatever loyalty she once held for him. She reached her hand deep into her oversized leather tote bag, digging for the evidence I needed to end this war once and for all. "No!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. He lunged violently toward us, attempting to physically snatch the bag right out of Maya's hands. He moved fast, but my preparation was faster. I had not driven to a megachurch in the middle of a corporate war zone alone. I had anticipated that cornered men would resort to violence when their financial crimes were exposed. Before Terrence's hands could even brush the leather of Maya's bag, two massive men in dark suits stepped out from the hallway and into the green room. They were the private executive security contractors I had hired the moment the divorce decree was signed. The lead guard grabbed Terrence by the collar of his expensive suit jacket and slammed him hard against the mahogany-paneled wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Terrence, leaving him gasping for air as the second guard pinned his arms securely behind his back. Loretta screamed, pressing her hands against her face in sheer horror as her golden boy was immobilized against the wall. Connor backed away slowly, his hands raised in surrender, realizing he was completely outmatched by the security team. He pressed his back against the far wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. Maya pulled a heavy black burner phone out of her bag and slapped it firmly into the palm of my hand. She looked at Terrence pinned against the wall with absolute disgust before turning back to face me. "Terrence is an idiot," Valerie, Maya said, her voice dripping with total contempt. "He talks a big game, but he has absolutely no idea how the financial structures actually work. He just likes spending the cash and pretending he is a mastermind." I looked down at the burner phone in my hand and then back up at Maya. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Terrence told me he used my father's digital signature to authorize the offshore transfers. He claimed he was the one controlling the accounts in the Cayman Islands. Maya let out a dark, knowing laugh and pointed a finger straight at Connor, who was trembling in the corner of the room. He lied to you, Maya revealed, dropping the ultimate bombshell. Terrence does not run the money, Valerie. The white boy does. Connor is the one who set up the entire offshore network. He completely bypassed Loretta and the church accounts months ago. Connor has been moving the bulk of your father's millions into his own private cryptocurrency wallets, and Terrence was too stupid to even notice that he was being robbed by his own partner. I slowly turned my head to look at Connor. The arrogant technology director who had blocked my car and threatened to destroy my father's legacy was suddenly sweating profusely. He looked frantically toward the doorway, measuring his chances of escape, but my security guards blocked the only exit. The entire power dynamic of the room had just flipped, and Connor knew his digital fortress had finally crumbled. I held the heavy black burner phone up so Connor could see the illuminated screen. The initial panic that had gripped him when my security guards pinned Terrence to the wall was rapidly fading. I fully expected him to beg for mercy or try to negotiate his way out of the room. Instead, he did something that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. He laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a forced chuckle. It was the deep, arrogant laughter of a man who firmly believed his privilege made him entirely untouchable. Connor reached up and casually straightened his expensive silk tie. He stepped away from the corner of the room, rolling his shoulders and looking down his nose at me with an expression of absolute disgust. "You really think this changes anything, Valerie?" he asked, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "You think waving a cheap burner phone around and bringing a crying mistress into a church is going to stop me? You are just as naive as your father." I kept my posture rigid, refusing to let his arrogance provoke an emotional reaction. "You built a criminal enterprise using my father's digital signature," I said, my tone dangerously quiet. "You stole millions of dollars from Washington Freight, and now you are going to federal prison." Connor took a slow, deliberate step toward me, completely ignoring the two massive security guards standing just feet away. He looked around the pastoral green room as if he owned the entire building. "I am not going anywhere near a federal prison, Valerie," he sneered, "because you are going to realize exactly how the real world works. Your father is a dinosaur. He built a regional trucking company by driving back and forth across the country for 30 years. That is just basic grunt work. Black-owned businesses like Washington Freight need guys like me to step in and structure real generational wealth." Jerome did not even understand what a Cayman Islands tax shelter was until I built one right under his nose. He should be down on his knees thanking me for modernizing his outdated operation. Terrence struggled against the security guard's grip, his face red with humiliation, as his own partner openly mocked his family. But Connor did not even glance at Terrence. He kept his eyes locked on me, a sickening smirk plastered across his face. "You two were practically giving money away to the government," Connor continued, taking another step forward. "I protected the assets. I created the shell companies. Terrence was just a useful idiot who handed over the administrative access tokens because he wanted to buy expensive watches and impress women. I am the architect of this entire financial structure, so you are not going to call the authorities, Valerie. You are going to wire $5 million into my primary brokerage account by the close of business today." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his extortion attempt hang in the silent room. "You want a $5 million severance package after stealing from my family?" I asked. Connor smiled, revealing perfectly white teeth. "I want $5 million to walk away and keep my mouth shut. Because if that money is not cleared in my account by 5 o'clock this evening, I am going to make one phone call to my personal contacts at the Internal Revenue Service. Jerome Washington gets raided before dinner, and his entire legacy burns to the ground." "You do not have the power to raid anyone, Connor," I stated without blinking. "Oh, I already proved I have the power," he shot back, his voice echoing with absolute triumph. "Why do you think your father did not answer his phone when you tried to call him this morning, Valerie? Did you really think he was just busy in a meeting? I did not just route corporate funds into offshore accounts. I used my banking contacts to flag every single one of his personal accounts for suspicious international activity." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face perfectly blank. Everything is frozen. Valerie Connor boasted stepping into my personal space, his personal checking accounts, his retirement funds, his savings. Even the mortgage auto pay on your precious family estate bounced this morning. Jerome Washington is completely locked out of his own life. He cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now without my permission. I hold all the cards and you are going to pay me exactly what I am worth. Maya let out a soft gasp from behind me, stepping further back as Connor's vicious threats filled the room. Terrence looked at Connor with sudden alarm, clearly unaware that his partner had taken the financial sabotage to such an extreme level. Even Loretta looked unnerved, her hands trembling as she realized the sheer scale of the destruction Connor had orchestrated. I looked down at the burner phone resting in the palm of my hand. Maya had not just given me a piece of plastic. She had given me the administrative keys to Connor's entire shadow network. I tapped the screen, bypassing the lock screen with the numeric code Maya had conveniently written on the back of an overdue hospital bill. The phone opened directly to an encrypted administrative banking portal that Connor had foolishly left logged in. "You think you are the smartest person in the room, Connor," I said, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. "You think your elite banking contacts are protecting you, and your privilege makes you invincible. But you are just as arrogant and blind as Terrence." I navigated through the complex series of menus, opening the alert logs for my father's frozen financial accounts. The data populated on the small screen, revealing the exact digital pathway that had triggered the catastrophic lockdown on Washington Freight's assets. I traced the origin of the suspicious activity flag, moving past the initial banking alerts and digging straight into the core authorization codes. "You did not use an IRS contact to freeze my father's accounts," I announced, staring at the glowing data. "This flag was not generated by a federal agency or a banking buddy. It was triggered automatically by the primary beneficiary of the Cayman Islands Shell Company." Connor frowned, his arrogant smile finally faltering as a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "I set up that security protocol myself. I control that shell company." "No, you do not," I replied slowly, turning the burner phone around so he could clearly see the official corporate registration documents displayed on the screen. "You thought you were playing everyone in this room, Connor," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You thought you were the brilliant architect pulling all the strings, but you got played just like the rest of them. The registered agent and the primary beneficiary of the offshore account is not you." I watched the color completely drain from Connor's face as his eyes scanned the digital document. "The registered agent," I read aloud, making sure every single person in the room could hear me, "is Loretta Carter." Connor stared at my phone in absolute disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He slowly turned his head to look at Loretta. Terrence was still pinned against the mahogany wall by my security guards, but he craned his neck to stare at his mother. The reality of the situation crashed over both of them at the exact same moment. They thought they were the masterminds stealing millions from my father's logistics empire. They thought they were building their own secret fortunes. But Loretta had played them both beautifully. She had manipulated her own son and his greedy business partner into doing all the heavy lifting. They had set up the shell companies and forged the digital signatures, taking on all the federal risk and leaving the digital fingerprints. But Loretta had quietly ensured her own name was listed as the sole beneficiary of the offshore accounts. The Church Youth Fund was never the final destination, and Connor was never the puppet master he thought he was. Loretta Carter was the true architect of the entire embezzlement scheme. The pious church matriarch dropped her innocent act immediately. Her posture straightened and the fake tears dried up in an instant. She did not bother to defend herself to her son or apologize to Connor. She simply grabbed her coat, shot me a look of pure venom, and walked straight out of the green room without a single backward glance. I knew exactly where she was going. Connor had frozen my father's accounts earlier that morning, and Jerome Washington was sitting at home completely vulnerable and confused by the sudden financial lockdown. Loretta was heading straight for him to execute her final desperate play before I could intervene. I told my security guards to escort Maya safely to her car and ensure she got home without any interference from Terrence. Then I sprinted out to the parking lot and jumped into my car. I broke every speed limit driving across Atlanta to my father's estate. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as I thought about Loretta using her sweet church lady persona to manipulate a man who had known her for decades. When I pulled through the wrought iron gates, I saw Loretta's luxury sedan already parked near the front entrance. I practically kicked the front door open and marched down the wide hallway toward my father's private study. I could hear Loretta's voice dripping with fake sympathy echoing from the open doorway. I slowed my pace and stepped quietly to the edge of the room, listening to her spin her toxic web of lies. My father was sitting behind his massive oak desk, looking tired and deeply stressed. His phone was resting on the desk, displaying multiple missed calls from his bank. He looked like a man whose entire foundation had suddenly crumbled beneath him. "I know this is terrifying, Jerome," Loretta was saying, her tone soft and soothing. "Terrence came to me this morning crying his eyes out. He made a terrible mistake with the corporate taxes. He got involved with some bad offshore investments and accidentally linked them to your personal accounts. That is why the federal government froze your assets today. I am so angry with him, but we have to protect you from the fallout." My father rubbed his temples, looking completely lost. "I do not understand how he accessed my administrative tokens, Loretta. My mortgage payment bounced this morning. My credit cards are declining everywhere. The bank will not even tell me what is going on, and my financial advisors are locked out of the system." Loretta leaned forward, placing her hand gently over his. "The IRS is going to seize Washington Freight by the end of the week, Jerome," she lied smoothly. "But I can save you. The Church Investment Board has a massive cash reserve. I can have my board buy Washington Freight from you today for 20 cents on the dollar. It will give you a massive injection of clean, untraceable cash. You can pay off the federal penalties, keep your estate, and retire quietly before the authorities draft an indictment. I will take on the burden of the company and fix the mess Terrence made." She was trying to steal his life work for absolute pennies. She had frozen his money, created a fake federal crisis, and was now offering to buy his company, using the very funds she had stolen from him in the first place. I stepped fully into the study. "You are not buying anything, Loretta," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air in the room. My father looked up in sheer surprise. "Valerie, what is going on? Why is Loretta telling me the IRS is coming for the fleet?" I walked directly over to the leather chair where Loretta was sitting. "The IRS is not coming for you, Dad," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the treacherous woman in front of me. "Your accounts were frozen by a private banking flag triggered by Loretta. She and Terrence embezzled millions from the company payroll. She is trying to panic you into selling your company for a fraction of its value, so she can cover her tracks and take complete control of Washington Freight." Loretta's face flushed with deep anger. She stood up, opening her mouth to weave another lie, but I did not give her the chance. I reached down and grabbed the handles of her heavily branded designer handbag, resting on the floor. I walked straight out of the study, carrying her expensive bag down the hallway and out the front door. Loretta chased after me, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floors. "Valerie, put that bag down right now," she demanded, her voice losing all its sweet southern charm. I stepped out onto the front porch and casually dropped her bag onto the hard concrete of the driveway. The contents spilled out, scattering expensive cosmetics and church flyers across the pavement. "Get off my father's property," Loretta, I ordered. "If you ever come near him again, I will bypass the civil courts and take my forensic audit directly to the FBI." She knelt on the driveway, hastily gathering her things. "You think you have won, Valerie?" she spat, glaring up at me with cold calculation. "You have no idea what we have prepared for you." She scrambled into her car and sped away down the long driveway, leaving black tire marks on the pavement. I walked back inside and found my father standing in the hallway. He looked completely heartbroken. The realization that his trusted son-in-law and longtime family friend had conspired to destroy him was taking a heavy toll. He looked at me, his shoulders slumped and his hands shaking slightly. "How are we going to fix this, Valerie?" he asked, his voice quiet and frail. I placed my hands gently on his shoulders. "We are going to get every single dollar back, Dad," I promised him. "I have the offshore account details and I have a witness who is willing to testify against them. I have a plan to unfreeze your accounts by tomorrow morning. You just need to trust me." He nodded slowly, letting out a long, heavy breath. But before I could explain the next phase of my strategy, my phone chimed loudly in my pocket. It was an urgent, high-priority alert from the Washington Freight Corporate Legal Department. I pulled the phone out and opened the encrypted email. My blood ran completely cold as I read the attached legal filing. Loretta was right. They had prepared something else. Connor and Terrence had not just been relying on the financial freeze. While we were arguing at the church, their lawyers had officially filed an emergency injunction with the state court system. They were petitioning a judge to immediately strip my father of his corporate authority and name Terrence as the acting chief executive officer of Washington Freight. I scrolled down to the justification section of the legal filing. Terrence and Connor had submitted dozens of pages of forged medical records claiming that Jerome Washington was suffering from severe advanced dementia. They claimed he was entirely mentally unfit to run the company and that his recent erratic financial behavior proved he was a danger to the corporation's future. They were using the exact financial freeze they created as proof that my father was losing his mind. I looked up from my phone and met my father's terrified gaze. There was no time to panic, and there was certainly no time to let Loretta or her son win this war. I immediately called our corporate legal team and forced an emergency mediation hearing before the judge could grant their ridiculous injunction. By 9 o'clock the next morning, we were sitting in a sterile glass-walled arbitration room in downtown Atlanta. The air conditioning hummed loudly overhead, doing nothing to cool the suffocating tension in the room. My father sat beside me wearing his best tailored suit, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. He had spent his entire life building Washington Freight from a single delivery truck into a national empire, and now two arrogant thieves were trying to steal it by declaring him legally insane. Across the heavy oak conference table sat Terrence and Connor. Terrence looked completely exhausted, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He had clearly spent the night dealing with a furious pregnant mistress and a mother whose master plan had just been exposed. But Connor looked entirely unbothered. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smirk that made my blood boil. Beside him sat a high-priced corporate litigation attorney who looked ready to slaughter us. The court-appointed mediator, a retired judge named Harrison, sat at the head of the table, reviewing the emergency petition. Connor's lawyer did not waste a single second. He stood up and slid a massive, thick binder across the polished wood table toward the mediator. "Your Honor, my client is simply trying to protect the shareholders and the employees of Washington Freight." The lawyer began, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We have provided comprehensive medical documentation proving that Jerome Washington is suffering from rapid and severe cognitive decline. He is exhibiting highly erratic financial behavior. Just yesterday, his personal and corporate accounts were flagged for massive international wire transfers and subsequently frozen by federal banking institutions. He is no longer mentally capable of running a logistics empire and requires immediate removal for the safety of the company." The lawyer tapped the heavy binder with his index finger. "We are requesting that the court grant temporary receivership of Washington Freight to Connor. As the current Director of Technology and Strategic Operations, he is the only executive properly equipped to navigate this crisis and stabilize the corporate assets." My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to defend his own sanity, but I placed a firm hand over his forearm, stopping him. If he lost his temper, it would only play directly into their narrative that he was unstable. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and turned my attention completely to Connor. Connor clearly took my silence as a sign of surrender. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let out a soft, condescending laugh. He looked at my father with absolute pity before turning his cold gaze toward me. "You need to let this go and let the men handle the business," Val Connor said, his tone incredibly patronizing. "Your dad built a nice little trucking company. Nobody is taking that away from his legacy. But the market has changed. It takes my kind of education to scale an operation like this into the modern era. You cannot run a national logistics network on handshake deals and blue-collar grit anymore." Connor continued his arrogant monologue, completely unaware of the trap he was walking into. Jerome belongs in a nice assisted living facility where he can relax and talk about the good old days, Connor mocked. I have the Ivy League degree. I have the banking contacts. I am the only one who can untangle this financial mess and keep the company from going under. If you fight this injunction, Val, the company bleeds to death in legal fees. But if you step aside and let me take over as acting chief executive officer right now, I will make sure your dad gets a comfortable monthly stipend for his medical care. The mediator looked over his reading glasses at me, waiting for my rebuttal. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my corporate laptop. I opened the screen and connected it to the large smart monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I clicked a few buttons, bringing up the exact medical records Connor's lawyer had just submitted to the court. The documents appeared on the large screen, complete with official-looking hospital logos, complex neurological terminology, and the signature of a prominent Atlanta neurologist. "It is a very impressive medical file, Connor," I said, keeping my voice smooth and conversational. "The clinic letterhead looks incredibly authentic. The neurological assessment reads exactly like a genuine medical diagnosis. You even managed to forge the signature of a doctor who specializes in early-onset dementia. If we were just looking at printed pieces of paper, you might have actually convinced the judge that my father was losing his mind." Connor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. "Those are certified medical documents submitted directly to the court docket," he stated defensively. "You cannot just stand there and call them fake because you do not like what they say." My lawyer verified the clinic credentials himself. I smiled, offering him a look of pure pity. "I did not just read the printed copies your lawyer handed over," I explained, typing rapidly on my keyboard. "When your legal team submitted the emergency injunction last night, they were required to upload the digital PDF files to the state electronic filing system. And as the director of technology, you really should know that every digital file carries a hidden footprint. You forgot to scrub the metadata, Connor." I hit the enter key and the screen behind me shifted. The fake medical diagnosis disappeared, replaced by lines of raw digital source code and file properties. I highlighted a specific block of text in bright yellow, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. I turned to the mediator and pointed at the screen. "Your Honor," I said clearly and loudly, "the metadata embedded in these medical files proves they were not generated by any hospital or clinic. The creation tags show these documents were authored exactly 48 hours ago." I tapped the screen again, pulling up the device registry logs I had pulled from the Washington freight servers. The authoring software was not registered to a medical professional. The unique machine access code and the serial number attached to the origin of these fake PDF files belonged to a specific company-issued laptop. I looked directly into Connor's widening eyes, the exact laptop that was assigned to Connor when he was hired. "You did not get these from a Dr. Connor. You typed them up yourself while sitting in your office on my father's payroll." Connor stared at the glowing monitor, his face draining of all color. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently glued to his features vanished completely, replaced by the panicked look of a cornered animal who realized his digital fortress was built on sand. His high-priced corporate attorney abruptly stopped packing his expensive leather briefcase and stared at his client in absolute horror. The lawyer immediately began shuffling his documents together, physically distancing himself from Connor, as if the technology director had suddenly contracted a deadly disease. Judge Harrison leaned forward, resting his hands on the heavy oak table. The retired mediator did not need to hear another single word from their side of the table. He slammed his thick file shut and announced with absolute authority that the emergency injunction was not only denied, but that he would be personally forwarding the forged medical documents directly to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal review. My father let out a long, ragged breath beside me, the heavy tension finally leaving his broad shoulders. But I was not finished. Defeating their pathetic injunction was merely playing defense. It was time to go on the aggressive offensive and burn their entire alliance to the ground. I closed my corporate laptop and reached back into my briefcase. Connor was already whispering frantically to his lawyer, desperately trying to salvage whatever legal protection he had left. but the attorney was aggressively shaking his head. Terrence sat frozen in his chair, staring at his business partner with a look of dawning confusion. He had been completely ready to lock my father away in a secure medical facility, but he had clearly believed the medical records were entirely real. Terrence was just a pawn who had absolutely no idea how the board was actually set up behind his back. I pulled a thick, glossy folder from my bag and slid it smoothly across the mahogany table, sending it directly toward Terrence. I bypassed Connor entirely. This was no longer about proving my father's sanity to a judge. This was about tearing their criminal syndicate apart from the inside out, using their own greed against them. I watched Terrence stare at the unmarked folder as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. "Go ahead, Terrence." I prompted, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "Open it. You love looking at financial reports. You love pretending you are the brilliant mastermind behind this massive operation. Let us look at the real numbers together." Terrence hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward his mother. Loretta had slipped into the mediation room just before the hearing, began sitting silently in the far corner and observing the proceedings with her usual pious expression. She gave Terrence a sharp warning look, silently commanding him to leave the folder alone, but his overwhelming curiosity and growing paranoia won out. He reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy cover open. Inside was a massive, highly detailed financial flowchart printed on oversized paper. I had spent the entire night working with my forensic accounting team, mapping out the exact trajectory of every single dollar they had embezzled from Washington Freight. I had traced the funds from our corporate payroll through the ghost employee accounts Maya had provided straight into the offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Terrence stared at the complex web of red and blue arrows connecting the various international accounts. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, holding his gaze. "You thought you were getting half, Terrence," I said, letting the cold reality sink into his mind. "You genuinely thought you and Connor were splitting the stolen logistics money evenly down the middle. But you are just as bad at basic math as you are at corporate loyalty. Look at the primary routing node right there in the center of the page. Look at exactly where the money went before it ever touched your private Cayman Islands account." Terrence's index finger slowly traced the thick red line on the paper. I watched his brow furrow as he read the names of the holding companies and the specific percentages listed clearly next to them. It took him exactly 10 seconds to realize he had been completely robbed by his own family. 40%, I stated, making sure my voice carried clearly across the silent room. Before a single cent of that embezzled money reached your personal accounts, Connor and your mother skimmed 40% right off the top. They routed it through a secondary shell company registered exclusively to Loretta Carter and managed entirely by Connor. You took all the massive federal risk, Terrence. You used your administrative access to bypass my father's security protocols. You put your own name on the fraudulent vendor invoices. You even dragged your pregnant mistress into the scheme to wash the cash for them. You did all the dangerous, dirty work while your own mother and your brother-in-law treated you like a complete fool. Terrence's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight collar. He slammed the folder shut with enough physical force to make the water glasses on the table violently rattle. He slowly turned his head to look at Connor, who was suddenly sweating profusely in his custom-tailored suit. "Is this true?" Terrence demanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and absolute betrayal. "Did you steal from me?" Connor let out a harsh, nervous laugh and tried to wave his hand dismissively. "Val is just trying to divide us, man," Connor stammered, taking a subtle step back toward the door. "She is just spinning the numbers to make us turn on each other. Do not listen to her lies." But Terrence was not listening to Connor anymore. He was looking at the undeniable mathematical proof printed right in front of him. He lunged out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the sterile carpet with a loud crash. He grabbed Connor by the lapels of his expensive jacket and slammed him backward against the glass wall of the mediation room. The heavy thud echoed loudly, causing the mediator to shout for security. "You stole from me, Terrence!" roared spittle flying from his lips as he shook the technology director violently. "I gave you the digital keys to the kingdom and you robbed me blind. You think you are so smart, you arrogant little thief. I brought you into this deal." Connor shoved Terrence back, his own volatile temper finally erupting under the physical assault. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure superiority. "Yes, I took the money," Connor shouted, shoving Terrence hard in the chest. "Because you are a complete idiot, Terrence. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. You are spending the cash as fast as we could steal it, buying luxury cars and expensive watches like a complete amateur. You were going to get us all caught with your flashy lifestyle. I was securing the assets. I built the entire offshore structure to protect us from your stupidity. You are just a glorified delivery boy playing dress-up in a corporate boardroom. You needed me to handle the real business." Before Terrence could throw a punch, a sharp, sickening crack echoed through the mediation room. Loretta had rushed forward from her quiet corner. She stood directly between the two men, her hand raised, and her face contorted with absolute righteous fury. She had just slapped Connor across the face with enough force to leave a bright red handprint rapidly forming on his pale cheek. "You do not ever speak to my son that way," Loretta hissed, her voice venomous and cold. "You work for us, Connor. You are nothing but hired help, and you will remember your place." Connor slowly raised his trembling hand to his stinging cheek. The entire room fell dead silent, except for the heavy, ragged breathing of the two men. Connor looked at Loretta, his eyes narrowing into dark, calculating slits. The last remaining shred of his corporate composure vanished completely, replaced by a chilling, ruthless smile. He casually adjusted his suit jacket and looked around the room, locking eyes with Terrence, Loretta, and finally me. "You think I work for you?" Connor sneered, his voice echoing with absolute triumph. "You think I am going to let you people drag me down to federal prison with you? I saw this disaster coming the moment Valerie found those offshore accounts. You are entirely on your own, Loretta. Because I sat down with the federal prosecutors at 8 o'clock this morning and I signed a full immunity deal." The word immunity hung in the sterile air of the mediation room like a physical weight. Connor stood up straight, brushing a speck of invisible dust from his lapel. His panic from just moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced by a sickening aura of absolute invincibility. He looked at Loretta and Terrence as if they were nothing more than dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. "I filed the paperwork 3 months ago." Connor bragged, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. "The Internal Revenue Service has a very generous whistleblower program. All I had to do was package up the financial discrepancies and hand them over to a federal agent. I played the role of the highly concerned technology director who stumbled upon a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. I gave them everything they needed to build a rock-solid case against Jerome Washington and his greedy son-in-law." Terrence lunged forward against the grip of the security guards, but they held him firmly in place. "You framed us!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "We did exactly what you told us to do." Connor offered a dark, remorseless smile. "I did not frame anyone, Terrence. I simply provided the digital footprints you so carelessly left behind. I made sure the offshore routing numbers were permanently attached to your login credentials. I made sure every single fraudulent invoice had your digital signature stamped right on the bottom. And I made absolutely certain that your father-in-law looked like the primary beneficiary of the entire criminal enterprise. When the federal agents raid Washington Freight, they are going to find a mountain of evidence pointing directly at the two of you." He turned his attention back to me, taking a slow, victorious step toward the conference table. "I am the hero of this story," Valerie Connor said, spreading his arms wide. "I am the White Knight who exposed a corrupt family dynasty. And the best part is the federal whistleblower reward program entitles me to up to 30% of the recovered funds. I am not just walking away with full legal immunity. The government is literally going to pay me millions of dollars for handing them your father's head on a silver platter. It is already done. It is completely too late to save him." The room fell dead silent. Loretta's face had drained of all color, realizing her entire life of luxury and status was about to be obliterated by a federal indictment. Terrence was openly weeping now, finally understanding the absolute magnitude of his own stupidity. The high-priced corporate attorney sitting at the table quickly packed his briefcase and walked out of the room without saying a single word, completely abandoning his client. I stood at the head of the conference table and looked at Connor. I did not scream. I did not panic. I simply kept my posture perfectly straight and let him finish his arrogant victory speech. When he was finally done gloating, I reached down and tapped the trackpad of my corporate laptop. The massive smart monitor on the wall behind me flickered and shifted. The forged medical records disappeared and were instantly replaced by a live feed of the Cayman Islands corporate registry. You really should have paid more attention in your business ethics classes, Connor, I said, my voice dropping to an ice-cold register. You think you are a mastermind, but you are incredibly sloppy. You assumed the federal prosecutors would just take your whistleblower report at face value and hand you a shield. But you forgot one very important detail about how offshore shell companies operate. I highlighted a block of text on the screen. The registry clearly displayed the administrative hierarchy of the offshore accounts. Loretta's name was listed as the primary beneficiary, but Connor's name and his personal social security number were permanently embedded in the foundational routing layers of the digital ledger. Your name is not protected, Connor, I pointed out. You are listed as the primary financial architect on every single transfer, but honestly, that is not even your biggest problem today. Connor frowned, his eyes darting toward the screen. It does not matter what the registry says, he countered, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant confidence. I already have the immunity deal. The prosecutors signed it this morning. I am legally untouchable. I slowly closed my laptop and rested my hands on the polished mahogany table. Federal proffer agreements require absolute and total transparency. Connor, I explained, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. In order to receive federal immunity, you must fully disclose every single financial crime you have ever committed. If you lie to the federal prosecutors, or if you omit any prior criminal activity during your proffer session, your immunity deal is retroactively voided. Connor swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat forming on his forehead. I told them everything about Washington Freight, he insisted. I am sure you did, I replied, maintaining my relentless eye contact. But you did not tell them about Horizon Logistics. You did not tell them about Apex Supply Chain. And you certainly did not tell them about Vanguard Shipping. Connor's entire body went completely rigid. His breathing stopped, and the arrogant posture he had maintained for the last hour instantly collapsed. While you were busy planning your brilliant whistleblower strategy, I was running a complete forensic sweep of your entire professional background. I revealed, my voice echoing through the silent room. You are not a criminal mastermind, Connor. You are just a repetitive parasite. You ran the exact same embezzlement scheme at your previous 3 employers. You skimmed millions off their accounts, set up identical offshore shell companies, and jumped ship right before the audits caught up to you. Connor took a stumbling step backward, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. How did you get that? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Those files were locked on a private encrypted drive. I bought a logistics empire back from the brink of bankruptcy, I said, my tone absolutely ruthless. You think I cannot hire a team to bypass a basic encrypted hard drive? You left a trail of stolen corporate funds stretching back nearly 7 years, Connor. And you conveniently forgot to mention any of those prior felonies to the federal prosecutors this morning. I picked up my phone from the table and held it up. 10 minutes ago, while you were bragging about being a white knight, I forwarded your unencrypted private emails and the complete forensic records from your past 3 jobs directly to the FBI, I announced. I also copied the exact IRS agent who signed your proffer agreement this morning. The color completely vanished from Connor's face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish white. He looked toward the heavy glass doors of the mediation room as if measuring his chances of making a run for the elevators. Your immunity deal is entirely void, Connor, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. And because you just sat in a room with federal agents and confessed to your involvement in the Washington freight embezzlement under a voided agreement, you just handed them a taped confession with absolutely no legal protection. You are not walking away with a whistleblower reward. You are going to federal prison for the rest of your natural life. The heavy silence in the mediation room was deafening after my declaration. Connor slumped against the glass wall, his knees giving out as he slid down to the floor. The reality of his situation finally crushed his arrogant delusion. He was no longer the brilliant architect of a financial empire. He was just another criminal facing decades behind bars. Terrence watched his business partner completely shut down. The panic in his eyes shifted wildly as he looked around the room searching for a way out. He turned his attention back to me, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. He took a slow, tentative step away from his mother and moved toward the center of the conference table. "Valerie, please, you have to listen to me." Terrence begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "You know me, Val. You know I am not a criminal mastermind. Connor manipulated me into doing this. He told me the company was losing money and this was the only way to protect our future." I stared at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. He looked incredibly small and weak. "I did it for us." Terrence continued, stepping closer and reaching out as if to take my hand. He ignored the two massive security guards who immediately stepped forward to block his path. "I wanted to give you the life you deserved. I wanted to prove to your father that I was a worthy successor. My mother and Connor twisted everything around. They used my ambition against me. You have to believe me, Val. Think about our wedding day. Think about the vows we made to each other before God and our families. You cannot let them send me to prison. I am your husband." I felt absolutely nothing for him. The man crying in front of me was a complete stranger. "You stopped being my husband the day you started stealing from my father," I said, my voice cold and hollow. "And you proved what kind of man you really are when you put your pregnant mistress on the company payroll to wash your stolen money." Terrence flinched as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to offer another pathetic excuse, but the heavy glass doors of the mediation room suddenly swung open. Maya walked into the room. She was no longer the terrified, trembling woman from the church green room. She stood tall, her shoulders pulled back, and her chin held high. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer and carried a thick manila folder in her hands. Beside her walked a formidable-looking corporate litigation attorney who immediately assessed the chaotic scene in the room with cold professional interest. Terrence backed away, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Loretta let out a sharp gasp and pressed herself into the corner of the room, realizing her nightmare was far from over. "I am not just walking away," Maya announced, her voice ringing clearly across the sterile room. "I thought about the deal you offered me, Valerie. I appreciate the offer of federal immunity. But immunity just keeps me out of jail. It does not punish the people who ruined my life." Maya's attorney stepped forward and placed a stack of legal documents directly onto the polished mahogany table. He slid one copy toward Terrence and another copy toward Loretta. "My client is filing a massive civil lawsuit against both of you," the attorney stated, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "We are suing for wire fraud, extreme emotional distress, and severe financial coercion. Terrence Washington deliberately deceived my client into signing fraudulent tax documents. Loretta Carter actively participated in the intimidation and manipulation of a vulnerable pregnant woman." Maya pointed directly at Terrence. "You thought I was just a dumb girl you could use and throw away?" she said, her voice filled with pure righteous anger. "You told me those consulting fees were legal. You made me sign papers when I was terrified and alone. But the burner phone you left at my apartment gave my lawyer everything he needed. We have every single text message where you and your mother discussed using my bank accounts to hide the money. We have the audio recordings of Loretta threatening to ruin my life if I ever went to the police." Loretta stumbled backward, clutching her expensive pearl necklace. The pious facade was completely shattered. She was looking at total financial ruin and public humiliation. The matriarch of the Greater Atlanta Cathedral of Praise was about to be exposed as a common thief and a ruthless manipulator. "This is a lie." Loretta gasped, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "You are all conspiring against us. You are trying to destroy my family." She pressed her hand hard against the center of her chest. Her eyes rolled back slightly and she collapsed heavily into one of the leather office chairs. She began taking loud, dramatic, gasping breaths, clutching her heart and crying out in sudden agony. "My heart." "Terrence," she moaned, her voice weak and strained. "I cannot breathe. They are killing me, Terrence. Call an ambulance." "Aman." Terrence panicked completely. He rushed to his mother's side, shouting for someone to call for medical help. The retired judge, acting as the mediator, immediately picked up the emergency phone on the conference table and called down to the building security desk. I stood perfectly still watching the pathetic performance. I knew Loretta was faking the medical emergency just to escape the room and avoid facing the consequences of her actions. It was the ultimate desperate play of a woman who had completely run out of options. She thought a ride in an ambulance would buy her time to contact her own lawyers and hide her remaining assets. Less than 3 minutes later, 2 paramedics rushed through the glass doors with a medical bag and a portable stretcher. They pushed past Maya and her lawyer, immediately attending to Loretta, who was putting on an award-winning performance of a dying woman. But the paramedics were not the only people who entered the room. Right behind the medical personnel walked 2 tall men wearing dark gray suits. They moved with absolute rigid authority, and their eyes scanned the room with terrifying precision. Heavy gold badges hung from chains around their necks, and earpieces curled discreetly behind their ears. The federal agents had arrived. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with sharp features, stepped forward and immediately blocked the only exit. His partner moved silently to the other side of the room, effectively trapping everyone inside. "Nobody leaves this room," the lead agent commanded, his voice carrying the undeniable weight of the federal government. "I am Special Agent Smith with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are operating a joint task force with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." The paramedics froze for a moment, but Agent Smith waved them forward, instructing them to continue assessing Loretta. However, the sudden appearance of the FBI seemed to miraculously cure Loretta's heart condition. Her dramatic gasping abruptly stopped, and she sat frozen in the chair, staring at the federal badges in sheer terror. Connor saw his final window of opportunity closing, and he instantly shifted his entire strategy. He scrambled up from the floor, abandoning his defeated posture. He smoothed down his suit jacket and raised his hands in the air, adopting a perfectly calm and submissive stance. He completely dropped his arrogant, aggressive tone and softened his voice to sound entirely unthreatening. "Officers, please listen to me." Connor said, his voice polite and highly respectful. He was weaponizing his race and his corporate privilege, relying on the assumption that the agents would naturally view him as the most reasonable and trustworthy person in the room. "I am incredibly glad you are here. I am just the technology director. I am just a salaried employee caught in the middle of a massive family dispute." Connor slowly lowered his hands and pointed directly at Terrence and my father. "They are the owners," Connor stated, projecting pure innocence. "Jerome Washington and his son-in-law run this entire logistics empire. They control the bank accounts and the payroll. They ordered me to set up those offshore accounts. They forced me to route the money. I tried to tell them it was illegal, but they threatened to destroy my career if I did not comply. I was terrified for my job. I am the victim here." Terrence stared at Connor, his mouth hanging open in complete shock as his partner effortlessly threw him directly under the federal bus. My father stood silently, his face tight with anger, but he remained perfectly composed, trusting me to handle the situation. Agent Smith looked at Connor, listening to his calm, articulate explanation. Then the agent turned his sharp gaze toward me. He had clearly read the initial reports and understood the basic power dynamics of the corporate structure. Connor let out a soft, patronizing laugh and shook his head, looking at me with manufactured sympathy. "Please do not listen to her, officers," Connor pleaded, gesturing toward me as if I were a fragile child. "Valerie is just his emotional daughter. She does not know anything about the books or how corporate finance actually works. She is going through a very bitter divorce, and she is grieving the end of her marriage. She is making wild, hysterical accusations because she is upset. You need to look at the owners. You need to look at the men running the company. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not argue with his deeply sexist and racist narrative. I simply maintained my ice-cold composure and reached into my leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out a massive, professionally bound document. It was over 500 pages thick, printed on heavy premium paper, and sealed with the official stamp of a leading independent financial auditing firm. It represented weeks of sleepless nights, endless forensic tracing, and absolute dedication to uncovering the truth. I walked slowly across the room and stood directly in front of Agent Smith. I looked the federal investigator dead in the eye and handed him the heavy document. "Agent Smith," I said, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had already won the war. "This is a complete legally bound forensic audit of Washington Freight and Logistics. It contains the raw blockchain trace data, the verified IP login logs, and the exact offshore routing numbers utilized in this embezzlement scheme." I turned my head slightly to look at Connor, who was staring at the massive document with growing horror. "It proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that every single fraudulent transaction was executed directly by Connor and Loretta Carter," I stated clearly. "And it also contains the unencrypted emails proving Connor stole from his previous 3 employers using the exact same methodology. You do not need to investigate this company, Agent Smith. I have already done your job for you. Now I suggest you read the executive summary on page 1 and arrest the man standing behind me." The sheer terror of spending his life in a federal penitentiary instantly overrode any remaining shred of logic in Connor's brain. He completely abandoned his calm victim routine and lunged forward across the polished mahogany table. He desperately grabbed his sleek silver laptop, throwing it open with trembling hands. The sharp clacking sound of his fingers frantically hammering against the keyboard echoed loudly through the silent mediation room. He was trying to initiate a remote wipe protocol. If he could just access the offshore servers in the Cayman Islands, he could scramble the digital ledgers. He could burn the raw data and destroy the routing history before the Federal Cyber Division could secure the live network. I stood perfectly still, watching the sweat drip down his pale forehead. He hit the enter key with brutal force, waiting for the confirmation screen. Instead, his monitor flashed a bright red warning. Connection failed. He gritted his teeth and typed in a secondary backdoor command. "Network timeout. Access denied." He slammed his fist against the table and tried a third routing protocol, his breathing ragged and shallow. "Are you trying to access the Cayman server gateway, Connor?" I asked, my voice smooth and entirely conversational. Connor ignored me, his eyes wide with absolute panic as he frantically hit the refresh key over and over again. The error messages continued to multiply across his screen, mocking his desperate attempts to hide his massive trail of felonies. "You really should have checked your network status before you started bragging about your brilliant whistleblower scheme," I told him, taking a slow step toward his side of the table. Exactly 1 hour before this mediation hearing began, I used my executive override credentials to access the Washington Freight Master mainframe. I blacklisted your specific machine access control address from our entire global network. Your laptop is completely severed from the internet, Connor. You cannot reach the offshore servers. You cannot access the shell companies. The accounts are completely frozen and the money is locked down. You cannot delete a single line of code. Connor stared at his useless laptop, his hands hovering over the keyboard as the absolute finality of his situation crushed him. He was totally trapped. Agent Smith flipped open the heavy forensic audit I had handed him. His sharp eyes quickly scanned the executive summary, absorbing the massive scale of the financial crimes. But the seasoned federal investigator was incredibly thorough. He looked up from the pages and locked his gaze on me. "This is an impressive document, Ms. Washington," Agent Smith said, his tone professional and guarded. "But we still have a significant problem regarding your father. The digital authorization forms for these offshore wire transfers clearly bear Jerome Washington's electronic signature. His authorized credentials were used to move the embezzled funds." Connor seized on this tiny sliver of hope like a drowning man grabbing a life raft. He spun around and pointed a shaking finger at my father. Yes, Connor shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. Jerome signed them. He authorized every single transfer. I just processed the digital paperwork. You have to arrest him. I offered Connor a look of pure, absolute pity. I reached out and gently turned to Section 4 of the heavy binder in Agent Smith's hands. Agent Smith, please direct your attention to the security logs on page 82, I instructed calmly. 4 months ago, I quietly upgraded the security protocols at every single Washington freight trucking depot across the country. I installed military-grade biometric scanners. Every time an employee enters or exits a shipping yard, they are required to provide a thumbprint and a retinal scan. Those physical timestamps are directly linked to our payroll and GPS tracking systems. I pointed to a specific highlighted column in the audit. Connor and Terrence used my father's administrative terminal in the Atlanta executive office to forge his digital signature, I explained, ensuring everyone in the room heard exactly how they had operated. But they were incredibly sloppy with their timing. Look at the transaction dated October 12th. A fraudulent signature authorizing the transfer of $3 million was logged from the Atlanta corporate office at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Terrence's terrified eyes. But at exactly 2:15 on October 12th, my father was physically clocking into the Savannah trucking depot. I revealed, my voice ringing with total vindication. Savannah is over 200 miles away from the Atlanta corporate office. The biometric scanners captured his thumbprint, his retinal scan, and a live video feed of him walking onto the loading dock. I have cross-referenced every single fraudulent signature with my father's exact physical location. It is physically and scientifically impossible for Jerome Washington to have signed those offshore transfer documents. The IP addresses used to forge his signature belong exclusively to the laptops assigned to Connor and Terrence. My father let out a quiet, ragged breath beside me. He placed a heavy, trembling hand on my shoulder, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of what I had been doing. I had not just been investigating the embezzlement. I had been building an impenetrable fortress around his legacy and his freedom. His name was entirely cleared. Agent Smith nodded, slowly closing the massive binder. He turned to his partner and gave a subtle gesture. The second federal agent immediately stepped forward and grabbed Connor by the arms, forcefully spinning him around and locking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Connor screamed and thrashed against the agent's grip, shouting that it was a setup, but his protests were completely ignored. Agent Smith then turned his cold, authoritative gaze toward Terrence and Loretta. Loretta saw the federal agent looking at her, and pure survival instinct took over. The pious, loving mother completely vanished. She scrambled out of her leather chair and practically threw herself against the conference table, pointing a manicured finger directly at her own son. I had nothing to do with this, Loretta cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. I am just a humble servant of the church. I do not know anything about corporate finance or offshore shell companies. Terrence managed all the church donations. He handled all the banking. My son did this. He used me. You have to believe me, I am completely innocent. Terrence stared at his mother in absolute horror. The woman he had lied for, the woman he had stolen for, the woman he had destroyed his entire marriage for, was now offering him to the federal government to save her own skin. The ultimate betrayal completely shattered whatever was left of his spirit. He slumped into his chair and buried his face in his hands, weeping openly. Before Loretta could continue her pathetic lies, the heavy glass doors of the mediation room swung open one final time. Pastor Evans, the senior leader of the Greater Atlanta Cathedral of Praise, walked slowly into the room. He was a tall, distinguished man who usually radiated warmth and comfort. But today his face was carved from solid stone. He looked deeply sorrowful and incredibly angry. He ignored the federal agents and walked directly toward Loretta. In his hands he carried a thick stack of official church financial documents. Do not lie in the presence of the Lord, Loretta. Pastor Evans said, his deep voice trembling with profound disappointment. And do not lie to these federal investigators. You told me the building fund was struggling. You told the congregation we needed more faith. Pastor Evans turned to Agent Smith and handed him the stack of papers. These are the tax-exempt authorization forms for the Cathedral Building Fund. Pastor Evans announced, the heartbreak evident in his eyes. I found them locked in a private safe in her church office this morning. They detail the exact offshore accounts Valerie Washington warned me about. And they bear Loretta Carter's explicit notarized signature on every single page. She did not just know about the stolen money. She orchestrated the entire church fraud herself. Loretta sprang up from her chair. Her miraculous recovery from her supposed cardiac event was absolutely instantaneous. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Pastor Evans, her face contorted in a mask of righteous indignation. "How dare you bring these worldly accusations into this room?" Loretta shouted, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence she usually reserved for the pulpit. "I am an elder of the Greater Atlanta Cathedral of Praise. I have served the Lord faithfully for 30 years. The devil is using this bitter woman to attack my family and tear down the kingdom of heaven." She raised her hands toward the ceiling, squeezing her eyes shut, and began loudly praying for deliverance, demanding that God strike down her enemies. It was a spectacular theatrical performance, but the audience was entirely unswayed. Pastor Evans did not flinch. He stood tall and resolute, his expression radiating profound sorrow and unyielding justice. "The Lord sees all things," Loretta. Pastor Evans said, his deep voice cutting through her frantic prayers like a heavy blade. "He sees the greed in your heart. He sees the millions of dollars you siphoned away from the faithful congregation who trusted you to build a community center for our youth. You did not steal from the devil. You stole from the widows, the working mothers, and the faithful families who gave their hard-earned money to the church." Loretta opened her eyes, realizing her spiritual manipulation was failing completely. She took a step backward, bumping into the heavy oak conference table. "I am the head of the building committee," she hissed defensively. "I decide how the funds are allocated. It was just a minor administrative error." "You are nothing of the sort," Pastor Evans countered, his tone carrying absolute finality. "As of this morning, the Board of Deacons held an emergency session. You are officially stripped of your title as head of the building fund. You are removed from the Board of Elders. And your membership at the Cathedral of Praise is permanently revoked. You do not represent our church, and you do not represent our faith." Pastor Evans turned to Agent Smith and formally handed over the thick stack of forged tax-exempt forms. "The church offers its full cooperation to the federal government in this investigation." Agent Smith nodded solemnly and gestured to his partner. The second federal agent immediately stepped forward, grabbing Loretta's arms and pulling them firmly behind her back. "Loretta Carter, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion," the agent recited calmly. Loretta began to thrash wildly, her expensive designer suit twisting out of place as the cold steel handcuffs snapped securely around her wrists. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I am a pillar of the community. I have immense social standing. You cannot put me in chains like a common criminal." "The law does not care about your social standing, ma'am," the agent replied forcefully, guiding her away from the table. With his mother neutralized, the reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate Terrence's thick skull. He remained slumped in his chair, his expensive silk tie loosened, and his posture completely defeated. An FBI agent approached him, gripping his shoulder and hoisting him forcefully to his feet. Terrence offered absolutely no physical resistance. His hands were pulled behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs sealed his ultimate fate. He looked across the room, his panicked eyes finding my face. He looked incredibly pathetic, stripped of all his manufactured corporate arrogance. He was no longer the brilliant executive who thought he could outsmart my father. He was just a terrified boy who had blindly followed his mother's greedy instructions. "Valerie, please," Terrence begged, tears freely streaming down his face. "Look at what is happening. They are taking my mother away. They are taking me away in chains. You have to stop this. You know I loved you. I really did love you." I stood beside my father, my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely devoid of any sympathy. I watched the man who had lied to me, manipulated my family, and plotted to destroy my father's legacy weep openly in front of federal agents. "We were supposed to build an empire together," Val Terrence sobbed, his voice cracking with desperate emotion. "We were supposed to run Washington Freight side by side. We were a team." I looked him dead in the eye, feeling absolutely nothing but cold vindication. I replied, my voice smooth and merciless. "You just tried to steal it." Terrence let out a loud, gut-wrenching wail as the agent forcefully escorted him toward the heavy glass doors. He stumbled over his own expensive leather shoes, his head hanging low in absolute disgrace as he was paraded out of the mediation room. But Connor was not going quietly. Despite being firmly handcuffed, Connor was aggressively fighting the agents. He threw his weight back and forth, screaming at the top of his lungs. His face was bright red and thick veins bulged against his neck. The arrogant calm he had maintained throughout the hearing was entirely gone, replaced by furious, unhinged panic. "You cannot hold me here!" Connor screamed, thrashing wildly against the two federal agents who were struggling to keep him contained. "This is an illegal detention. My lawyers will crush you in federal court. I will sue the FBI. I will sue the IRS. I have the best corporate defense attorneys in the country on retainer, and they will tear your entire department to shreds." Agent Smith stepped squarely into Connor's path. The veteran investigator did not raise his voice or show any sign of intimidation. He simply stared down at the struggling technology director with a look of supreme professional boredom. "You do not have any lawyers, Connor." Agent Smith stated, his voice incredibly calm and flat. Connor froze, his frantic thrashing coming to a sudden halt. He stared at the agent, his chest heaving rapidly. "What are you talking about?" Connor demanded. "I have millions in offshore accounts." "Not anymore," Agent Smith replied, delivering the final devastating blow. "Based on the digital forensic evidence provided by Ms. Washington, we contacted the Cayman Islands financial authorities precisely 10 minutes ago. We initiated a total asset seizure under the RICO Act." Connor's eyes widened to the size of saucers. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act allows the federal government to immediately freeze and seize any assets tied to a continuing criminal enterprise, Agent Smith explained, speaking slowly so the reality would fully penetrate Connor's arrogant mind. "Every single dollar in those offshore shell companies has been confiscated by the federal government. Your domestic bank accounts are completely frozen. Your stock portfolios are locked down. Your luxury vehicles will be impounded before you even reach the federal holding facility." Agent Smith leaned in, slightly lowering his voice to a tone that carried perfectly through the silent room. "You are not going to hire a high-priced corporate defense team, Connor, because you are entirely broke. You have absolutely $0 to your name. You will be assigned a public defender just like every other common thief we pull off the street." The absolute finality of the agent's words hit Connor with the force of a freight train. The millions of dollars he had carefully stolen, the luxurious future he had planned, and the untouchable corporate shield he had built were all gone in an instant. He was completely destitute, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Connor let out a raw, guttural scream of pure despair as his knees finally gave out. The agents did not bother trying to hold him up. They simply dragged him across the carpet, his expensive custom-tailored suit wrinkling as they pulled him toward the exit, leaving a trail of shattered arrogance in his wake. The heavy glass doors of the mediation room stood wide open, framing the spectacular downfall of the people who had tried to destroy my life. The commotion had drawn the attention of every single employee on the executive floor. Secretaries, account managers, and logistics directors stood frozen by their cubicles, watching in absolute stunned silence as the federal agents marched their prisoners through the bullpen. Terrence walked with his chin buried in his chest. His expensive designer suit looked rumpled and pathetic as the heavy steel cuffs bound his wrists behind his back. The whispers of the staff rippled through the office like a shockwave. Men and women who had taken orders from him just yesterday now stared at him with pure disgust. He did not dare lift his head to meet their eyes. Loretta followed closely behind, flanked by a female FBI agent. The disgraced church matriarch was sobbing uncontrollably, trying in vain to use her bound hands to shield her face from the dozens of cell phones recording her walk of shame. The pious mask she had worn for decades was gone, replaced by the terrified reality of an elderly woman facing a long stay in a federal penitentiary. Connor was the last to be dragged through the double doors. He was still fighting, still muttering frantic, meaningless tech jargon about proxies and encrypted firewalls. He looked completely unhinged. The brilliant architect of a multi-million-dollar fraud was now nothing more than a broken, babbling criminal being shoved into the back of a black government SUV. I watched the convoy of federal vehicles pull away from the corporate plaza through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom. The silence they left behind was heavy but incredibly peaceful. It was the sound of a massive storm finally breaking. I felt a warm, heavy hand rest gently on my shoulder. I turned to find my father standing beside me. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes shone with a profound mixture of awe and absolute pride. The formidable founder of Washington Freight suddenly looked like a man who had been given a second chance at life. Jerome Washington, the man who had built an empire from a single delivery truck, wrapped his arms around me and pulled me into a deep, crushing hug. I rested my head against his chest, feeling the solid, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I am so incredibly sorry, Valerie," my father whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion. "I am sorry I ever pressured you to make that marriage work. I was so blinded by my own outdated ideas of what a perfect family should look like that I pushed you to stay with a snake. I handed Terrence the keys to the kingdom because he looked the part, while you were the one who actually possessed the strength and the brilliance to protect it." He pulled back slightly, keeping his hands on my shoulders, and looked me dead in the eye. "You did not just save my company today, Valerie. You saved my life, my legacy, and my freedom. You are brilliant. You are twice the executive I ever was, and from this moment forward, you are running Washington Freight. No more living in the shadows. The throne is yours." I smiled at my father, feeling the last lingering weight of my childhood insecurities completely evaporate. I had finally earned the exact validation I had been fighting for my entire life, and I had done it entirely on my own terms. As my father left the room to address the bewildered staff and restore order to the company, I noticed Maya lingering near the doorway. Her high-priced litigation attorney had already departed to file the civil lawsuits, but she had stayed behind. She stood awkwardly, clutching her purse over her pregnant belly, looking entirely unsure of where she belonged in the aftermath of the explosion. I walked over to her, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. She tensed slightly, clearly expecting me to dismiss her or lash out now that the mutual enemies had been removed. "You played your part perfectly today, Maya," I told her, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "You stood up to the people who tried to use you, and you secured your own future." Maya let out a shaky breath, looking down at her shoes. "I do not know what my future looks like now," she admitted quietly. "I have the lawsuit, but lawsuits take years. Terrence left me with nothing. I do not have a job. I do not have health insurance. I have a baby coming in 4 months, and a resume with a massive gap on it, because I let a married man convince me to be his hidden secret." I looked at the young woman standing in front of me. Months ago, I would have felt a surge of bitter vindictiveness. I would have wanted her to suffer for sleeping with my husband. But the truth was, Terrence had manipulated both of us. He had weaponized her youth and naivety, just as he had weaponized my loyalty. Punishing her would not fix my marriage. It would only continue the toxic cycle of women tearing each other down for the sins of worthless men. I reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You have a gap on your resume because you were employed as an administrative assistant under fraudulent pretenses by the former vice president of this company," I stated, making it a matter of corporate record. "But Washington Freight is currently under new management. We are cleaning house, and we need dedicated, honest people to help rebuild." Maya stared at me, her eyes widening in pure disbelief. "I am officially rehiring you, Maya," I told her, offering a genuine smile. "You will start as an administrative assistant in the logistics department on the 3rd floor. It is a legitimate salaried position with full corporate health benefits. You will clock in, you will do the work, and you will earn honest money to raise your child. Tears instantly welled in Maya's eyes, spilling over her cheeks as she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "You would really do that for me?" she sobbed, her voice thick with absolute gratitude. "After everything I was a part of." "You are a mother now," I replied, handing her a tissue from the conference table. "It is time to start building a life you can be proud to tell your child about. HR will email you the onboarding paperwork by tomorrow morning. Do not be late for your first day." Maya hugged me tightly, whispering endless thank yous, before she turned and walked out of the office, her posture completely transformed. She was no longer a terrified mistress hiding in the shadows. She was a woman who had been given a real chance to rewrite her own story. I walked back into my corner office and sat down behind my sleek glass desk. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, bathing the room in warm, golden light. The chaos of the morning was finally over. The company was secure, my father was safe, and my toxic marriage was officially dead and buried. I opened my laptop to review the transition protocols when a new message notification popped up on my screen. It was an email marked with high-priority flags. I clicked it open and smiled. It was a joint message from the chief executive officers of Connor's previous 3 employers, the men he had quietly robbed before slithering into Washington Freight. I had sent them encrypted copies of the forensic audit outlining exactly how Connor had breached their systems, hoping they could use the data to plug their own security leaks. The email was brief but incredibly satisfying. "Mrs. Washington," the message read, "we cannot thank you enough for the bulletproof evidence you provided. Based on your forensic tracing, our combined legal teams have just filed federal grand jury indictments against Connor. With the interstate wire fraud charges stacking up across 4 different corporate jurisdictions, the prosecuting attorneys have assured us he is facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. Checkmate." It had been exactly 32 days since the federal agents cleared the rot out of Washington Freight. The transition of power had been surprisingly seamless. Stepping into the role of chief executive officer felt less like taking on a new burden and more like finally slipping on a coat that had always been tailored precisely for my shoulders. The air in the corporate headquarters felt lighter. The lingering toxic tension that Terrence and Connor had injected into every boardroom meeting was completely gone. In its place was a renewed sense of purpose and absolute clarity. My father had kept his word, stepping back into an advisory role and spending his newly found free time actually enjoying the fruits of his lifelong labor. Even Maya was thriving. She had started her position in the logistics department 3 weeks ago and had already proven herself to be sharp, dedicated, and incredibly eager to learn the business. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the finalized architectural blueprints for our new automated distribution center in Texas. It was late afternoon and the Atlanta skyline was painted in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The silence in my office was absolute perfection. Then my private cell phone began to vibrate across the smooth glass surface of my desk. I glanced down at the screen, expecting a call from our lead contractor. Instead, the caller identification displayed an unfamiliar automated number from a federal correctional institution. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I considered ignoring it completely. I had spent the last month legally severing every remaining tie to my past life. The divorce papers had been expedited and signed by a judge. The asset division was a swift and brutal victory for my legal team, since Terrence had zero leverage and was currently fighting multiple federal indictments from a jail cell. But a tiny sliver of curiosity compelled me to reach out and answer the call. An automated voice informed me that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. I accepted the charges and pressed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "Valerie, is that you?" The voice on the other end was raspy and weak. It sounded like it belonged to an incredibly old, broken man, but I recognized the pathetic pitch immediately. It was Terrence. I did not offer a greeting. I just waited, letting the silence stretch across the line to assert absolute control over the conversation. "Valerie, please do not hang up." Terrence begged, his words rushing together in a frantic panic. "You have to help me, Val. It is an absolute nightmare in here. You have no idea what they are doing to me. The food is inedible, and the guards treat us like animals. I cannot sleep. I cannot breathe in this tiny cell. I am losing my mind. I let out a slow, steady breath, feeling entirely detached from his suffering. You are in a federal holding facility, Terrence. I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. That is generally how prisons operate. You are not staying at a luxury resort on the company dime anymore. He let out a ragged, desperate sob. My mother is dying in here, Val, Terrence cried out, ignoring my coldness. They put Loretta in the general population ward. She keeps screaming scriptures at the guards and demanding to speak to the church elders, but nobody will take her calls. The church completely abandoned her. The board of deacons froze all her personal accounts to audit the building fund. She does not have a dime to her name and her health is actually failing. She cannot survive this. And Connor, that absolute coward, threw us completely under the bus. Terrence's voice pitched higher with fresh indignation. As soon as the federal prosecutors offered him a deal, he flipped on us. He gave the Federal Bureau of Investigation all the internal encrypted emails. He testified that my mother and I forced him to set up the offshore accounts. He is getting a reduced sentence in a minimum security camp while they are trying to bury me under 30 years of federal racketeering charges. You chose your partners, Terrence, I reminded him smoothly. There is no honor among thieves. I warned you about trusting a man who stole from his previous employers. Val. I need a real lawyer, Terrence pleaded, dropping the updates and moving to his actual agenda. The public defender they assigned me is absolutely useless. He just wants me to plead guilty and accept 2 decades behind bars. I need the Washington corporate legal team. I need you to pay for my defense fund. We were married, Val. You know my heart. You know I'm not cut out for this place. Just wire the retainer fee to a private defense firm. You have the money now. You are running the whole empire. Please, Val, I am begging you. I listened to his pathetic whining, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. I did not feel the need to yell. I did not feel the need to gloat or rub my victory in his face. He had already destroyed his own life far more thoroughly than I ever could. I leaned back in my leather executive chair and looked out at the beautiful, sprawling city I now controlled. You had a wife who loved you, a father-in-law who trusted you, and a golden ticket to generational wealth. I stated, my voice perfectly calm as I delivered the absolute undeniable facts of his existence. You threw it away because you could not stand a woman being smarter than you. I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear his excuses, his tears, or his empty apologies. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I opened my contact settings and permanently blocked the institutional number, ensuring he could never reach me again. I set the phone face down on my desk and turned my attention back to the blueprints of my future. The days following the arrests were an absolute whirlwind of federal debriefings and intense internal restructuring. I did not take a single day off to celebrate. There was no time for a vacation or a victory lap while the company was still bleeding. Washington Freight had survived a massive infection, and it was my sole responsibility to administer the cure and ensure the patient fully recovered. My first order of business was completely obliterating the archaic financial infrastructure that Connor had so easily exploited. I fired the entire remaining accounting department, knowing that complacency was just as dangerous as outright theft. I brought in an entirely new team of independent cybersecurity experts and top-tier forensic accountants. Together, we built a proprietary blockchain-based financial network from the ground up. I instituted absolute transparency protocols and strict multi-signature authorization requirements for every single transaction over $500. The biometric scanners I had installed at the trucking depots were now fully integrated into the corporate payment gateways. Our new system was a digital fortress. It was absolutely impenetrable. I spent countless nights running penetration tests and simulation attacks, ensuring that no one could ever bleed my father's company dry again. The days of blind trust and handshake deals were officially replaced by cold, hard, encrypted data. 6 weeks later, the Department of Justice officially released the frozen corporate assets back into our primary accounts. The offshore funds that Terrence and Connor had tried to steal were fully repatriated. Sitting at my desk looking at the restored balance sheet, I knew exactly what needed to be done with that money. It belonged to the people who had kept the trucks running while the executives were busy plotting treason. I called a mandatory company-wide town hall meeting in the main warehouse. The massive space was packed with drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and administrative staff. They looked incredibly nervous. The past few months of federal raids and executive arrests had left the workforce deeply unsettled and fearing for their livelihoods. I stood on a raised platform, looking out at the sea of anxious faces. I did not offer them corporate doublespeak or hollow platitudes. I told them the absolute truth. I explained exactly how close we had come to financial ruin, and I thanked them for their unwavering dedication during the darkest period in our history. Then I pulled out a stack of heavy envelopes. I announced that every single loyal employee who had stayed with us through the storm was receiving an immediate 20% bonus retroactively applied to the entire fiscal year. The silence in the warehouse was momentarily deafening. Then the room absolutely erupted. Grown men who had driven our rigs for decades were wiping tears from their eyes. The cheering echoed off the high metal rafters, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. As the applause finally began to settle, my father slowly walked up the metal steps to join me on the platform. He looked out at his workforce, the people he had spent his life providing for. Jerome Washington took the microphone from my hand, his presence commanding instant, absolute silence. He cleared his throat, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He did not talk about profit margins or quarterly projections. He talked about legacy. He talked about his own arrogant blindness and his failure to protect the company he loved. He publicly apologized to the entire staff for allowing toxic ambition to poison our culture. Then he turned to me. He placed his heavy, weathered hands on my shoulders and spoke directly to the crowd. For years, I thought I needed a son to take over this empire. My father said, his voice echoing powerfully across the warehouse. I looked for a successor in the wrong places, and I trusted the wrong men. But the savior of Washington Freight was sitting right in front of me the entire time. My father turned back to the crowd, his chest swelling with absolute pride. As of today, I am officially stepping down from all daily operations. I am passing the torch to the only person truly qualified to carry it. Valerie Washington is the permanent chief executive officer of this company. The roar of approval from the employees was deafening. It was not polite corporate clapping. It was a massive, overwhelming wave of genuine support. I did not just wear the title of chief executive officer. I owned it completely. With the internal rot eliminated and the workforce morale at an all-time high, I shifted my focus from defense to aggressive expansion. I was no longer just the forensic auditor playing cleanup. I was the visionary leader my family had always desperately needed. For months, I had been secretly analyzing the shifting landscapes of global commerce. I knew traditional freight routes were becoming obsolete. I requested a meeting with the executive board of the largest retail logistics conglomerate in North America. They were actively looking for a regional partner to handle their entire southeastern distribution network. It was a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and every major freight company in the country was fighting for it. I walked into their glass-walled boardroom in Chicago, armed with flawless data and absolute unshakable confidence. I did not just offer them trucks and drivers. I offered them the impenetrable biometric tracking system I had built. I showed them exactly how our new technology guaranteed zero inventory shrinkage and unprecedented delivery speeds. The executives were completely blown away. They had expected a standard pitch from a traditional trucking company, but I gave them a brilliant glimpse into the future of automated logistics. 3 days later, the official contract arrived in my inbox. I had not just secured the account, I had completely revolutionized our business model. The ink on that signature effectively doubled the total valuation of Washington Freight overnight. I stood by the windows of my corner office, looking out over the sprawling loading docks below. The empire my father built was safe, but the empire I was building was going to change the industry forever. The quiet girl who had been told to simply stand beside her husband and smile was gone. I was the architect of my own destiny, and I had never felt more powerful. 6 months later, the view from the executive corner office was nothing short of spectacular. I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline as the early morning sun bathed the glass towers in brilliant gold. I smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored navy blue suit, feeling the heavy, expensive fabric settle perfectly against my shoulders. It was a suit designed for a leader, a woman who commanded absolute authority and demanded total respect. The massive mahogany desk behind me was completely clear of the usual chaotic corporate clutter, holding only a single sleek tablet displaying the finalized quarterly financial reports. The balance sheet staring back at me was an absolute masterpiece of fiscal perfection. There were no hidden offshore transfers, no dummy shell corporations siphoning off our margins, and no unexplained equipment deficits. Every single dollar was meticulously accounted for and generating legitimate, massive profit. Washington Freight was not just surviving the agonizing transition, it was entirely dominating the southeastern logistics market. I walked over to the desk and picked up my steaming mug of dark roast coffee, letting the comforting warmth seep into my palms. The corporate suite was incredibly silent at this early hour, but my mind briefly echoed with the fading ghosts of the past. I thought about Terrence sitting in a bleak federal penitentiary stripped of his tailored designer suits and his manufactured corporate arrogance. I thought about his mother Loretta trading her commanding pulpit and her expensive, extravagant church hats for a standard-issue prison uniform. They had looked at me and seen a naive, unsuspecting target. They had looked at my quiet demeanor and my preference for complex spreadsheets over loud social gatherings, and they had severely miscalculated my intelligence. They honestly thought my introversion was a symptom of blindness. They assumed that because I did not demand the spotlight at every gala, I was entirely ignorant of what was happening in the dark shadows of my own company. But my silence was never a weakness. It was my greatest tactical weapon. It allowed me to watch, to listen closely, and to silently gather every single piece of damning ammunition I needed to completely destroy them. Even worse, they had looked at my agonizing inability to carry a child and deemed me fundamentally broken. Terrence had cruelly weaponized my deepest personal pain using my infertility as a convenient, pathetic excuse to seek comfort in the arms of a younger, naive woman. He had genuinely believed that my perceived failure as a traditional wife would keep me forever compliant and desperately begging for his manufactured affection. He thought I would blindly cling to our toxic marriage just to maintain the fragile illusion of a perfect, successful family. He never understood that losing the future I had planned did not break me. It forged my spirit into something entirely indestructible. I did not need to give birth to a child to leave a lasting, meaningful legacy in this world. My legacy was the massive corporate empire I was currently running with absolute, ruthless precision. The company had never operated with such incredible, seamless efficiency. The new biometric security protocols and blockchain financial systems we installed had quickly become the ultimate gold standard for the entire commercial shipping industry. Other major logistics firms were actually contacting us daily, offering wildly lucrative consulting fees, just to learn how we had successfully built such an impenetrable digital fortress. The massive new contract I had recently signed with the national retail conglomerate had already required a massive expansion of our corporate campus, bringing in hundreds of new high-paying jobs to the local community. I was not just maintaining my father's legacy, I was exponentially multiplying it. My employees walked through the building with a renewed sense of immense pride and absolute security. Maya had just been promoted to senior logistics coordinator last week, completely excelling in her new role and proving that offering a second chance to the right person yields incredible dividends. She had welcomed a healthy, beautiful baby boy a few months ago, and the company had covered every single medical expense, providing her with the exact financial stability Terrence had brutally tried to steal from her. Watching her thrive in the corporate environment, free from the toxic manipulation of my ex-husband, was a daily reminder that true leadership involves lifting up the people around you rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me perfectly in the present moment. I looked down past the manicured corporate plaza to the massive active loading docks stretching out toward the interstate highway. The sprawling distribution depot was buzzing with constant rhythmic industrial activity. Dozens of pristine white trucks proudly bearing the Washington Freight logo were rolling out of the massive bay doors, lining up in perfect synchronized formation to deliver goods across the entire country. My father was currently on a luxury cruise through the Mediterranean Sea, finally enjoying his hard-earned retirement with the absolute certainty that his life's work was in the safest possible hands. He had built this incredible company from absolutely nothing, sacrificing his youth and his energy to create an empire. But I was the one who had secured its permanent future and propelled it into a new era of unimaginable technological success. I had purged the infection from our ranks and fortified our walls against any future attacks. I watched the lead truck merge seamlessly onto the bustling interstate, carrying the heavy weight of our family name toward a brighter, more prosperous horizon. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle deep into my bones, replacing the anxiety and anger that had fueled me for so long. The devastating betrayal, the endless late nights tracing fraudulent accounts, the intense federal raids and the painful public humiliation of my marriage ending were all just necessary, agonizing stepping stones on the path to my ultimate coronation. They had tried to break me down to absolutely nothing. They had plotted for years to steal my family fortune, ruin my father's failing health, and leave me completely destitute, while they built their own luxurious, untouchable paradise on my ashes. They had underestimated my brilliance, my resilience, and my absolute refusal to be a victim in my own story. But they had made one massive, fatal error in their perfectly calculated plan to destroy me. When people try to bury you, they usually forget that you are a seed, and I just grew into an oak tree. The greatest lesson we can take from Valerie's journey is that true power does not come from seeking validation from those who deliberately underestimate you. It comes from silently building an unshakable foundation while they mistake your quiet grace for weakness. When toxic people attempt to bury your potential, they are simply planting the seeds of your ultimate success. You must never allow someone else's arrogant narrative to dictate your worth. Have you ever had to cut toxic relatives out of your life to finally achieve your own peace? Share your triumphant experiences in the comments below and please subscribe.